Islamic world. They show us how a culture perceives itself and what it wants to pass on to the next generation. They are a mirror of the resentment and powerlessness that have characterized Islam's relationship with the West for generations. Chapter 3 of Hollows and Shadows, or, A Culture is Ashamed but Does Not Want to Admit It. Plato's allegory of the cave, from the 7th book of the Republic, accurately captures the state of thought in the Islamic world that has been observed for several generations. A group of people have been bound in a cave since childhood, so that they can only see the cave wall in front of them. A fire burns behind them, casting shadows onto the wall. This allows the people to perceive their own shadows and what is happening behind them. When someone speaks behind them, the opposite wall reflects the words, which is why the people believe the shadows are speaking to them. The core question of this allegory: what would happen if these people freed themselves from their bonds and turned around? At first, the prisoners were blinded by the light of the fire, and the people and objects in the cave appeared shadowy and unreal. They preferred to return to their familiar shadow on the wall to orient themselves. For centuries, the Islamic part isolated itself from the rest of the world, staring at its own shadow and thinking that was the world. Until the superior other emerged and forcibly opened the hollow. When Napoleon's fleet landed in Alexandria in 1798, an asymmetrical encounter took place between a superior European power and a stagnant Arab culture. At that time, Islam had little significance as a political factor. The region was ruled by Mamluk mercenaries and the religion was heavily mixed with superstition and folk myths. Nevertheless, even then, Muslims believed they were the best that humanity had ever produced, as stated in the Quran. The task of the religious institution Al-Azhar was simply to promote the memorization of the Quran, to provide religious opinions on everyday matters, and to lend a certain legitimacy to the foreign rule of the warlords. A school was attached to the mosque, but the vast majority of Egyptians could neither read nor write. Only the appearance of the other made the Muslims aware of their own weakness and backwardness. But it wasn't a kiss that awakened Sleeping Beauty. The appearance of the other would have been more like a kick in the butt, had the defeated Fellahin are indigenous Egyptian rural villagers, primarily farmers, not refused to see the arrival of the French as the dawn of a new era, and so they pulled the pillow of their own faith over their ears. Misguided attempts at modernization by the Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali Pasha were followed by traumatic experiences of colonialism, exploitation, and oppression that are deeply engraved in the collective memory of all Muslims. The result is an anthropological wound, as the Syrian philosopher George Tarabishi calls it, a chronic illness that persists to this day. The Islamic world's encounter with the West has always provoked two irreconcilable processes: the urge for openness and modernization, and the return to faith out of fear that everything will dissolve with this openness. And in the end, the traditionalists always won because the repertoire they appealed to always remained stable and unchallenged. Namely, the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, and the simple division of the world into believers who do everything right and unbelievers who only bring disaster whenever they appear. The Orthodox always had it easy, for they merely had to reduce the situation to zero and appeal to the Prophet's original community. The renaissance of the faith and the instrumentalization of Islam as a political power were clearly evident during the Crusades and colonialism. In times of unrest, a community seeks a cultural repertoire with which to mobilize its own people. Since Islam has allowed few secondary identities over the centuries, it ultimately remained the only power to which a defensive culture appeals in order to hide its shame. Shame turns to fear. Fear turns to faith. Necessity turns to mission. In his great work Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre explains the moment of the appearance of the other as the discovery of one's own shame. He uses the memorable keyhole parable, which also applies to the Islamic world. A person observes others through a keyhole. When he is caught, he is ashamed. In his most famous play, No Exit, Sartre emphasizes the idea of the other. Hell is other people. I realize that I am in hell. All eyes are on me, those gazes that are devouring me. Sartre's shame is like a fall from grace, the embarrassment of which the stranger only makes embarrassing with his observation. It was the Caesarean gaze of Napoleon's soldiers upon their subjugated subjects that unleashed shame and anger among the fellahin living in the caves along the Nile. These gazes robbed them of their illusion of omnipotence. The more the French stared at them, the more angrily and disoriented the fellahin reacted. More than 200 years later, the situation is little different. A culture is internally ashamed and compensates for this with demonstratively displayed moral superiority. You have the clocks, but we have the time, a Moroccan once said to his French colonial master. For one's own protection, the superiority of the other is declared a myth. He becomes an intruder, whose struggle can transform shame into a mission. The other is reduced to an essence that represents everything the cave dwellers abhor. Instead of addressing the ambivalence of Europeans, they are always portrayed as immoral specters. Europeans also like to play this game when it comes to Islam. Plato's parable concludes with the question of what would happen if one of the prisoners were freed from the cave by force. Although he initially had difficulty adjusting to the sunlight, after a while he would adapt to the new environment. If he were to return to the cave, he would no longer be able to make sense of the shadows and movements. The way he interpreted the cave and what happened within it would then conflict with the prisoner's perceptions. He and his corrupted eyes would be laughed at. From then on, they would kill anyone who tried to free them from their bonds and expose them to natural light, a phenomenon that Erich Fromm calls the fear of freedom. For although humans are oriented toward this freedom, whether and how they realize it depends on their personal and social situation. Some critics of Islam make the mistake of describing the core problem of the Islamic world as a struggle between individuality and community. Viewing the individual as the sole antithesis of community is a fatal error. It is the individual's fear of loneliness and their own unpredictable impulses, as well as their desire for warmth, orientation, and recognition, that enable a community to function. The individual does not emerge without the pressure of a community that compels them to distance themselves from it, and a community cannot exist without individuals who share its values and thus enable its functioning. The French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy views the individual as merely the remnant of a community that has collapsed. The isolation of the individual from his community is in turn the beginning of the emergence of a new one, which also draws boundaries with other communities and demands loyalty from its members. Before he became a prophet, Muhammad was a loner who was dissatisfied with the customs of his community. Therefore, he broke away from it and founded Islam, which in turn put pressure on his new followers and swore them against their opponents. Lenin, too, was once an individual who thought and acted differently from his surroundings. From the thoughts of the two revolutionaries and through their efforts, however, two systems emerged that uniformed people and their souls. Both idealists were intoxicated by their own power and were soon overtaken by reality, so that, without realizing it, they acted, or were forced to act, against their own former principles. However, one must not forget that many people only feel comfortable in uniform. No matter who puts pressure on whom, the community and individual remain allies. It remains an interplay. Erich Fromm assumes that every person is strongly influenced by the structures of the society in which he lives. These structures tend to shape the psychological energies of the individual in such a way that he enjoys doing what he has to do so that this society can exist in its particular form. Seen in this light, self-realization of people from their own individual impulse has not yet been realized in any society in the world. We are all trapped in our systems, and even freedom is nothing more than a concept of freedom that is prescribed to us. The prerequisite and the idea of revolution arise from the self-understanding of the system, not from the idea of an individual. The revolutionary leader is merely a mouthpiece who gives voice to what has already been brewing among the masses. He only speaks out what everyone knows and wants, but cannot formulate. Even revolution is an escape into the collective. Fromm identifies three escape routes taken out of fear of freedom: authoritarian tendencies, the drive for destruction, and automatic conformity. Because freedom from something is not complemented by a meaningful freedom to, a confusion is created that often turns the positive goals of freedom into an individual and collective prison. Thus, one can say that the opposite of individuality is not community, but uniformity. The visible and invisible pressure to conform that a society exerts on its members is the true enemy of individualism. Seen in this way, none of us are true individualists in one form or another. For how many of us leave the hollow of thought into which we were born and interpret the world beyond the logic of the shadow that the system casts upon us through its socialization? Fromm's idea can perhaps be exemplified by a do-it-yourself shop for furniture and household goods. There, the power is not of bids, but of offers. Such a business model creates the illusion in the customer of individuality and creativity, because they can put together the goods themselves. In reality, they find only limited combinatory possibilities and operate within the framework of the manufacturer's imagination. In this store, the well-spoken citizen is nothing but an instrument, a consumer, yet they are given the feeling of being a designer. Many of us find it difficult to recognize that we live in an IKEA. IKEA is a multinational conglomerate founded in Sweden that designs and sells ready-to-assemble furniture, household goods, and various related services. And Bauhaus Society. The Bauhaus was a German art and design school that existed from 1919 to 1933, most of us, anyway. It is always only a few who leave the prescribed path and venture into new territory. These people may sometimes make history, but they usually remain solitary and misunderstood by society. They are social heretics, cursed during their lifetime and often recognized after their death. Curiosity may be in every person's nature, but knowledge is not the goal of every individual, for the path to it is often rocky and lonely. And the appeal of knowledge would be small, if so much shame did not have to be overcome on the way to it, says Nietzsche. And this shame always stands in the way of the Islamic world. Because there was no Prometheus in the founding myth of Islam who stole fire from the gods, there is also no Faustian soul, as Oswald Spengler calls it, that could unleash a process of enlightenment in the Islamic world. Isolation and the prolonged contemplation of one's own shadow leads not only to self-aggrandizement but also to paranoia. Any criticism from outside is interpreted as a declaration of war, any questioning from within is interpreted as heresy, as treason. The more closed a society, the more it perceives the outside world as hostile. The moral code becomes stricter and the pressure on one's own followers grows to engender unconditional loyalty. Physical and intellectual concealment is prescribed. Faustian ideas are stifled before they are born. Intruders and apostates are the most feared and unhostile. The more the closed community feels the influence of the outside world, the harder it strikes its own members who step out of line. An isolated society thrives on solidarity, surveillance, and silence and dies of cultural incest. The greatest atrocities are covered up by the heads of families and suppressed by the subjects. Anyone who defies this logic risks, at best, exile or burning. Reformers in the Islamic world often paid with their lives for their attempts at transformation, but often many of them returned to the cave, voluntarily reinstating themselves in shackles and turning their gaze to the shadow. Chapter 4. What went wrong? Or, the long farewell to the Orient. One could say that Islam had an easy birth, a turbulent childhood, a short fertile youth and a long, lethargic period of decline. The historian Ibn Khaldun writes of the Arabs that they were destructive by their nomadic nature and possessed little talent for artistry. But he also admires the transformative power of Islam, which transformed warring nomads into a culture-creating civilization. This is an argument many Muslims use against the idea of secularization. They believe that Europe had to abandon the rule of the Church because the Church was stubbornly opposed to science and innovation. Yet it was Islam that first transformed the uneducated Arabs into a sophisticated culture that was superior to Europe in all areas of knowledge during the Middle Ages. It remains questionable, however, whether this golden age in the Middle Ages was actually due solely to Islam. The rapid expansion of Islam a few years after its birth is due to the contradictory but effective combination of several basic elements: the Quran as the direct word of God, a clear image of God; the reconciliation of monotheism and ancient Arabian traditions, Jewish legality and the associated clear instructions for action, tribal consciousness and a sense of community; and a claim to universality that sees jihad as a permanent condition. The principle of blood kinship of pre-Islamic Arab tribal societies was replaced or supplemented by the principle of faith. It was clever that Islam, at least in principle, did not distinguish between Arabs and other peoples once they submitted to Islam. However, the cornerstones of the Quran, the image of God, legality, class consciousness, the claim to universality, and jihad later proved to be Islam's undoing, as they were never renegotiated or transformed. These principles are indeed responsible for the discipline and mobilization of fighters that made Islam's first victories possible. Nor should we forget that Islam was born at a historically favorable moment, as the two great empires, the Sassanid Empire in present-day Iran and the Byzantine Empire, had been mutually weakening each other in wars of attrition since late antiquity. Both empires had Arab tribes fighting for them as vassals, who at the time mastered the most modern military techniques. When Muhammad unified Arabia, these tribes converted to Islam in the name of blood kinship and brought these techniques with them. Islam offered them the option not to fight for the great empires and against each other, but to become a great empire themselves. In fact, both empires fell within a relatively short period of time due to the wars of the Arab tribes and were largely Islamized. According to Islamic historiography, the Prophet Muhammad is said to have sent letters to the Sassanid king inviting them to convert to Islam. "Be a Muslim, and you will be saved," was supposedly the content of his message. No non-Islamic sources confirm this invitation or suggest that these kings even noticed Muhammad. Apparently, the Muslim historians simply wanted to prove that Muhammad's concern was only the spread of his message and not conquest. It is noteworthy that these historiographical works were written during the period of Islam's great waves of conquest. During his lifetime, Muhammad himself made no attempt to conquer these territories. He merely roamed the Byzantine border with 30,000 men, avoiding engagement in battle, in order to impress the surrounding Arab tribes, who had not yet formed alliances with him. When they saw Muhammad return from Byzantine territories without losses, they assumed he had defeated Byzantium and submitted to his power. Up until Muhammad's death, the concepts of jihad and Sharia had not yet been concretized. A written Quran did not even appear until 10 years after his death. It was Muhammad's successors who rapidly brought the territories around Arabia under their control. They were the ones who canonized the Quran and interpreted jihad and Sharia in a way that suited their strategies of rule and conquest. Less than 100 years after the Prophet's death, the entire Middle East, North Africa, and Andalusia were firmly in Muslim hands. It remains to be seen whether this expansion was due solely to the military skills of the zealous Muslim fighters or whether several other factors were at play. One cannot ignore the fact that Islam filled a power vacuum left by the declining Byzantine and Sassanid empires. In addition, the Muslim conquerors did not force their new subjects to convert to Islam as long as they paid the jizya, the protection tax. This rapid expansion was accompanied by both economic prosperity and scientific upheaval, from which the conquered territories also benefited. Neither the Arabs nor Islam alone were responsible for this revolution, but rather the mixing of nations during the Islamic advance. A dynamic that, incidentally, Alexander the Great also encountered when he conquered the Orient. Through Arab expansion, the Arabs encountered rich remnants of ancient cultures and different religions. Jews and Christians, Syrians and Egyptians, Sabaeans and followers of Zoroaster, Kurds and Berbers, who were more zealous in their faith than the Arabs and wanted to prove themselves as true servants of Islam. No one was denied advancement as long as they demonstrated their loyalty to Islam. Even non-Muslim scientists, translators, and artisans were included in this process. The fusion of deep-rooted cultures, rich in world knowledge, with the Arab-Islamic dynamic generated a tremendous modernization surge in the Middle East. Avicenna, Farabi, Khwarizmi, John of Damascus, Averroes, and Maimonides, the main protagonists of this process, were not Arabs. nor were the birthplaces of Islam, Mecca and Medina, the centers of knowledge of this period, but Damascus, Baghdad, Bokhara, Cairo, and Cordoba. The Arabs possessed two qualities back then that they have lost today: self-confidence and a strong capacity to integrate the knowledge of others. They were not afraid of contact with those of other faiths and utilized their expertise as translators or researchers. They had the works of antiquity translated into Arabic and called the ancient Greeks al-Qudamae, the ancestors. Even though Jews and Christians had to live a second-class citizens under Islam, they were not seen as a threat at the time, but rather inspired and enriched by them. The Arab conquerors encountered educated, Hellenized Christians and Jews and debated with them about the nature of God and creation. In this context, Islamic theology, kalam, emerged, which flowed into Arabic philosophy, but which was not Arabic at all. Since the Quran does not tell coherent prophetic stories, but only fragments, it was Jewish interpreters who, with their Hebrew stories, provided Israelite, an important source for Quranic exegesis. Christians possessed the cult figure of Jesus, who was considered the Son of God and a miracle healer. Since Muhammad never performed miracles and did not die a martyr's death, but rather of a fever, Muslims could not bring him into the debates as a counterpart to Jesus. This role was now to be played by the Quran, as the miracle of God, the Word. Although the Quran was already considered created and not eternal by the Mu'tazila school of thought in the 8th century, it was only sacred by the 9th century. The further Muslims moved away from the time of the Prophet, the more sacrosanct the Quran became and the more strongly they clung to its letter, an attitude that continues to hinder the reform of Islam today. During and after the Crusades, however, there were mass conversions, the exact causes of which have not yet been investigated. However, it is plausible to assume that this conversion had two reasons. First, the Oriental Christians wanted to dispel the suspicion that they were collaborators with the Crusaders. Second, the ongoing fighting weakened the economy, and the conversion was an attempt to avoid high taxes in times of economic hardship. The converts also likely wanted to circumvent the new, stricter dhimmi laws for minorities that had been enacted in the wake of the Crusade paranoia. With the Mongol invasion, 1258, and the destruction of Baghdad, paranoia hardened in the minds of the Muslims. Many attributed the defeat to the Muslims distancing from the principles of Islam. Baghdad was a liberal center of thought and life, where alcohol, dancing, singing, and even heresy were tolerated. Islamic theology, based on the principle of fiqh, or understanding, increasingly narrowed into a stagnant, literal interpretation of the Quran. All knowledge is contained in the Quran was the new mentality that ushered in the Muslims' distancing from worldly knowledge. The faith was to be purified and freed from foreign influences. The end result was the demonization of philosophy and the oppression of minorities and women. Not only was social dynamism hampered, but scientific collaboration with non-Muslims also ended. In addition, a significant economic factor marginalized the Middle East's importance for international trade. The discovery of the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 by the Portuguese Vasco da Gama. From then on, not only merchant ships deserted the Arabian territories, but so did secular knowledge and new ideas. Changes in educational policy also accelerated the decline of the Golden Age of Islam. During its heyday, schools taught mathematics, philosophy, and medicine in addition to the Quran, which gave strong impetus to research and innovation. Before and after the destruction of Baghdad, the empire fragmented into small kingdoms, Seljuks, Fatimids, Abbasids, and later Mamluks and Safavids, that fought among themselves. Each ruler surrounded himself with warlords and mercenaries who supported his power. However, he could rarely pay them with cash, so he compensated for their services with land or entire city districts. This not only weakened the peasants but also hampered education. Although the warlords built mosques and schools in their city districts, they were not interested in science and philosophy. From then on, schools were to teach only religion. The teachers strove to portray the warlord as an impeccable servant of Islam, otherwise, he would close the school. Loyalty instead of knowledge, glorification instead of free thought, was the tenor of the new education. This attitude remains the core of educational philosophy in most Arab states to this day. From this point on, Islamic education meant nothing more than the religious indoctrination of children. Memorization and the inculcation of unrealistic self-images and worldviews catapulted the Islamic world into final isolation. The Ottomans claimed their conquests were solely intended to spread Islam. This may explain Turkish expansion in Europe. However, the Middle East had been Islamized since the 7th and 8th centuries, and yet the Ottomans invaded, slaughtered fellow Muslims, and conquered Syria in 1516 and Egypt the following year before controlling the entire region. 400 years of Ottoman rule over the Arabian Crescent, from present-day Morocco to the Persian Gulf Coast, further isolated this part of the world from neighboring European culture. The victorious Turks spread even more narrow-minded conservative ideologies and enshrined a degrading view of women. Gender apartheid, which was already rooted in Arab tribal tradition, was now further exacerbated by the Turkish harem mentality. When the Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali Pasha, 1769–1848, wanted to break away from the Ottoman Empire and modernize the country in the 1830s, he was stopped by the Europeans, especially the English, who preferred to ally themselves with the Ottomans against him. While, over the course of the 18th century, the philosophy of the Enlightenment and technical innovations in Europe sparked an industrial and intellectual revolution that would fundamentally transform the West within a few decades. Lethargy and superstition reigned in the Middle East. Parallel to the profound developments in the north, a man on the Arabian Peninsula also sought to radically reform thought. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, 1702–1793, the founder of the Wahhabi movement, demanded that everything un-Islamic be banished from everyday life, society, and thought. He wanted a direct return to the letter of the Quran. All non-believers and even Muslim mystics were to be combated. What seems almost ironic about this purist movement is that it called its approach tajdid, or renewal. The concept was based on a prophecy of the Prophet that Allah would send a mujaddid to the Muslims every 100 years to renew their faith. Renewal, in this context, unequivocally means purification and a return to the roots. When Muhammad Ali Pasha tried to crush this movement because it stood in the way of his attempts at modernization, he was prevented from doing so by the British. the British Crown allied itself with the Saudi tribe, an alliance that was in many ways unwholesome and continues to this day. At the end of the 19th century, the idea of nationalism also took root in the Arab world. Following the example of the German nation-state founded under Bismarck, the Arabs wanted to form a modern, united nation-state. The ideology of nationalism gave birth to two movements that later became archenemies and have significantly shaped the fate of the Middle East for over 100 years. And continue to this day. Zionism arose in Europe, and Pan-Arabism in the Arab world. Both sought to escape European oppression, yet both also took Europeans as a model. Both nationalist movements were attracted to socialism. An interesting question is why the Zionists, who initially operated outside the Middle East and thus were in a supposedly worse starting position, succeeded in establishing a functioning democratic state, while the Arab experiment, launched in parallel, failed. Arab nationalism was built on myths and personality cults, whereas Zionism, as a movement, pursued several strategies in parallel. The Zionist idea was developed in the writings of Orthodox Jews such as Nathan Birnbaum, 1864–1937, and secular thinkers such as Theodor Herzl, 1860–1904. Journalists and lawyers, students, and established figures, men and women, participated in the Zionist congresses, which emphasized the diversity of the state to be founded from the very beginning. On the other hand, only men, most of whom had studied in the West, led the nationalist discourse in Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and also Iran in the style of an enlightened leader. The Jewish nationalist movement was divided, on the one hand, into political Zionism, which placed the Zionist idea on the international political agenda through negotiations with politicians of the major powers. The aim was not only to convince Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, and Great Britain of the Jews' right to a nation-state, but also the Ottoman Empire. Herzl even visited the Ottoman Caliph in Istanbul to persuade him to make a piece of land in Palestine available to the Jews. On the other hand, the Jewish nationalist movement practiced practical Zionism, which organized the emigration of Jews to Palestine and founded kibbutzim there in which socialist ideas were to be put into practice. Furthermore, a vital movement, cultural Zionism, existed, ensuring that not only Jewish tradition but also the ideas of the Enlightenment were imported to Palestine. Although the Jews suffered severe oppression in Europe, they did not renounce the European intellectual tradition, having contributed significantly to it through their thinkers and scholars. On the other hand, the project of Arab unification fizzled out, as it was unplanned from the outset and relied on slogans and state concepts. In Palestine, the Zionists were farmers, workers, and guerrilla fighters. But when Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel in May 1948, all underground fighters submitted to state authority. Even before the founding of the state, Ben-Gurion had sunk a ship that was attempting to smuggle weapons into the country on behalf of the Jewish underground fighter Menachem Begin, who later became the country's foreign minister and prime minister. Despite numerous wars and a constant threat from the Arab neighbors, the decision was made to embrace a democratic order, thus creating the region's first democracy. It was these same wars that further strengthened the dictatorial power of the Arab leaders and turned them into untouchable despots. No voice may rise above the voice of battle, President Nasser of Egypt once said in order to silence critical voices in the country during the war. On the other hand, the kibbutzim continued to develop after the founding of Israel. Doctors, artists, and professors worked the land together and did not insist on work that matched their qualifications. For this, the Zionists coined the term Avodah Ivirit, Jewish work, to distinguish themselves from the couch potato mentality of the hierarchically minded Arabs. A discriminatory but effective approach. On the other hand, the Arab rulers built their power on weapons and used Israel's existence as a constantly repeated argument to oppress their own population. However, I would like to make it absolutely clear that this portrayal should not be understood as a declaration of love for Israel or as an excuse for Israeli policy in the occupied territories. After all, the Israelis themselves rarely missed an opportunity to make mistakes. For example, after the victory in the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel missed the chance to conclude a just peace with its neighbor from a position of strength. A humane solution for the Palestinian refugees could also have been found with Israeli help. Instead, a settlement policy was pursued which to this day makes a two-state solution almost impossible and threatens to strangle Israel from within. The conflict began with a struggle of right against right and ended with a struggle of injustice against injustice, says Norwegian peace researcher Johan Galtung. Today, both sides are competing to see who the greater victim is. When Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, 5 Arab armies, poorly armed and with little knowledge of the enemy, descended upon their new neighbor, whose existence the Arabs considered illegitimate. The young Israeli army defeated the Arab troops and consolidated its control over the heartland of Israel. Among the humiliated Arabs in Palestine was the young Egyptian officer Gamal Abdel Nasser, 1918 to 1970. 4 years after the defeat, Nasser, attracted by socialism and supported by the Muslim Brotherhood, brought a military coup to power in Cairo. King Farouk of Egypt was forced to abdicate, left the country, and went into exile in Italy. Nasser, the new sole ruler on the Nile, pursued 3 goals: the introduction of real socialism, the modernization of Egypt and the destruction of Israel or their conquest of Palestine. To build new industries, Nasser needed new energy sources and therefore initiated the mammoth Aswan Dam project, seeking international loans to finance it. However, the World Bank refused to provide financing because of his proximity to the Soviet Union and his anti-Israel rhetoric. To realize his project, he expropriated the Suez Canal, which at the time was under Franco-British control. The former colonial rulers, France and Great Britain, with Israel's help, attempted to regain control of the Suez Canal through a military strike in the fall of 1956. Although the attack devastated the cities surrounding the canal remained in Egyptian hands, and Nasser was celebrated as a hero. With the help of the Soviet Union, Nasser rearmed and firmly believed he would soon destroy Israel. But the Israelis were faster and attacked Egypt in June 1967 without declaring war. They succeeded not only in conquering Jerusalem, but also the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank and the Syrian Golan Heights. After Nasser's project to liberate Palestine ended in catastrophe, faith in nationalism and socialism also faded. An entire generation throughout the Arab world was affected by this defeat. Once again, the Arabs stood before the ruins of an incalculable adventure and sought orientation. Al-Islam huwal hal Islam is the solution, was the motto of the Islamists, who were now increasingly joined by those seeking orientation. Fundamentalism flourishes on the ruins of failed experiments, writes the French author and Islam critic Abdelwahab Meddeb. While the first Palestinian commandos fighting against Israel consisted of Marxists and, in some cases, even atheists. The Arab-Israeli conflict increasingly mutated from a territorial to a religious confrontation. It wasn't until the 1980s that Hamas emerged as a political force in the Palestinian territories. Hamas is considered a branch of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in 1928. Hamas was initially tolerated or even supported by the Israelis to act as a counterbalance to Yasser Arafat's secular Fatah movement. Later, however, Hamas's aggression was directed against Israel. In the early 1950s, it was also the Muslim Brotherhood that had helped Nasser come to power. After seizing power, he had to imprison its leaders because they agitated against his socialist policies. When Anwar al-Sadat wanted to open Egypt to the West, the Nasserists and Marxists rebelled. Sadat sought salvation by releasing the Islamists from prison in order to weaken the Marxists. A fatal mistake, for which he would pay with his life a few years later. Indeed, after their release, the Egyptian Islamists succeeded in ousting the Marxists, but they also opposed Sadat's peace policy toward Israel. And so Anwar Sadat was ultimately assassinated by the very men he had previously pardoned. Two Islamist movements succeeded in establishing their radical ideologies throughout the Islamic world, the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. The petrodollars of the Gulf and reactionary thinking on the Nile managed to dominate Arab thought at the end of the 20th century. In Afghanistan, the outgrowths of both movements managed to unite. With the help of the Americans, who were active against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the Islamists were able to leave their countries and meet in the Hindu Kush to fight against the Soviet troops. From an alliance of Arab discontent, Western arbitrariness, and Saudi donations, Al-Qaeda emerged in the Afghan mountain valleys, which most clearly illustrates the Arab misery. They buy Western video cameras to record the execution of Western journalists and rely on sensationalist Western TV stations to spread terror around the world. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Wahhabis not only convey the ideology of jihad through the schools and satellite broadcasts worldwide, but also their irreconcilable views of humanity, society, and women. Schizophrenia means division. Division creates despair. No other ideology resonates as well with the desperate masses as that of the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda. Rage and megalomania are the fuel in the heavy Islamic combustion engine. While Arab thought is increasingly oriented toward the past, the consumption of Western and Chinese consumer goods is drastically increasing, without any consideration for the environment. At the same time, Western mass tourism is flooding most Islamic states and is one of their main sources of income. Many who work in this industry feel as if they have sold their souls to the devil. While tourists are served kindly, their wealth is secretly envied, and they occasionally commit sin with them. Skepticism toward them as decadent unbelievers remains prevalent. Tourism rarely brings enlightenment and dialogue, but instead confirms many Muslims' assumptions about the reckless decline of morals due to Western influence. Contact between East and West, as so often happens, is an asymmetrical encounter, in which the Muslim is dependent on the tips of the European, whom he despises from the bottom of his heart. The tourist often only follows the prescribed route of prejudice and sees little of the countries that might inspire him to reflect. He has access to places that most locals are not allowed to enter. In holiday destinations, where there is usually a massive water problem and where the population has to use water very sparingly, waiters see how tourists waste vast quantities of water in hotel complexes, swimming pools, and on golf courses. They even steal our drinking water, said an Arab immigrant who used to work in a hotel in his home country. They eat our flesh and throw away our bones. Behind this resentment, too, lies a disappointed love. In his home country, he met a tourist who had fun with him during her vacation. When he proposed to her, he discovered that she was already married. Thus, his plan to come to Europe was initially a failure. Even though he later succeeded in reaching the promised land of the unbelievers by other means, he could not shake off his resentment. Sex tourism is no longer a fringe phenomenon in many Arab states, but an integral part of the tourism industry. Muscular young men offer themselves to older female tourists, and young Eastern European prostitutes cater to the male guests. In Tunisia, there's even a business-like term for it: business. This violates the stubborn tradition and exposes people's double standards. It shows that the otherwise strict sexual morality in Islamic society is merely artificial and is maintained not always out of piety, but rather due to a lack of opportunity. But sex tourists are not only decadent Europeans, but also Arab gentlemen from the Gulf. States who seek paid love in the nightclubs of Cairo, Beirut, and Damascus in the summer. The moral disorientation of young Muslims often leads to radicalization. 4 former friends of mine have since become conservative Muslims who refuse to shake hands with women even though they used to serve alcohol to tourists in hotel complexes. One of them even considers terrorist attacks against tourists justified, because they would not only destroy the environment but also the faith of Muslims. The attacks in Luxor, Bali, and Jerba, island in Tunisia, demonstrate that radical Islamists view tourists as crusaders. The governments in Islamic countries pay little attention to this. They continue to tolerate the balancing act of planting Westerners as enemies in the minds of Muslims while simultaneously inviting them as tourists in the name of Arab generosity. No plans are being developed to combat water shortages, which could plunge the entire region into bitter civil wars. There is no plan for life after tourism or oil. Chapter 5. The obsession of sickness, or why Muslims are so reluctant to think about their self-misery. With his Egyptian campaign, Napoleon wanted, on the one hand, to establish the basis for a large French colony in the Orient and, on the other, to disrupt England's path to its colonies in India. Through skill and a clever arrangement with the religious leaders of the Al-Azhar Mosque, Napoleon was soon able to consolidate his power on the Nile and put down an attempted uprising. The Egyptians were never great revolutionaries and had mostly accepted any ruler who seized power. The religious leaders, who received monthly salaries from Napoleon, were able to calm the Egyptians' anger at being ruled by an unbeliever, but the feeling of humiliation remained. The French attempted to calm tempers somewhat with the rumor about Napoleon's conversion to Islam. Similarly, during Rommel's, Johannes Erwin Eugene Rommel, popularly known as the Desert Fox, was a German general field marshal during World War II, advance into Egypt. German authorities spread the rumor that Hitler had converted to Islam in order to encourage the Egyptians to revolt against British colonial rule. Proximity to the people through apparent religiosity was always a key to power in Egypt, even in pre-Islamic times. Even Napoleon's role model, Alexander the Great, transformed from an aggressive invader into a popular ruler of Egypt when he was baptized as the son of the god Amun in the Temple of Siwa. French archaeologists and geographers arrived with Napoleon's troops and compiled the first encyclopedia on Egypt. They discovered the Rosetta Stone, with the help of which Jean-François Champollion, 1790–1832, was able to decipher the ancient Egyptian language and hieroglyphs, a milestone in Egyptology. Within a few months, the French had introduced new technology, a functioning administration, and a judicial system to Cairo. However, after a year, Napoleon was forced to return to France after learning of the severe setbacks suffered by the French forces in Europe. He left command of the troops stationed in Egypt to General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, who was unpopular with the Egyptians. Kleber was soon assassinated by a zealous Al-Azhar student named Al-Halabi. A tribunal was subsequently established for the perpetrator, where he received a fair trial. The Egyptians, who were accustomed to the fact that anyone who rebelled against the ruler was executed without trial, were impressed by the French approach, which gave the accused the right to self-defense. Egypt's first modern historian, Abderrahman al-Gabarti, 1754–1829, who witnessed this trial, called the assassin a reckless, stupid boy because he had harmed Egyptian interests with his rash act. More than 150 years later, that student appeared as a folk hero in history books and plays during the formation of a modern nation-state under President Nasser. There was no mention of the achievements brought to the country by the French or the alliance between Napoleon and the Al-Azhar scholars, but rather of how brutal the French were and how Napoleon, mounted on horseback, had entered the Al-Azhar mosque and desecrated the building. The stupid boy has also been resurrected by modern Islamists as the prototype of the jihadist fighter against the West. Since culture has long lacked new heroes, they seek them out in history and recycle them to construct a continuity in national and religious resistance. The gap between Saladin, who defeated the Crusaders in the Middle Ages, and the modern era is filled with imaginary heroes. After 3 years, the French adventure in Egypt was over, and the troops returned to France. A whiff of the French Revolution remained, but only a whiff. Shortly after the French withdrawal, some religious leaders, merchants, and dignitaries gathered and decided to depose the Mamluk ruler Khurshid Pasha and replace him with the Albanian mercenary Muhammad Ali Pasha, who was considered a devout Muslim of integrity. This was the first and last peaceful transfer of power in Arab history. Either the ruler passes power on to his family or he is replaced by another ruler by force. The term former Arab president therefore does not yet exist. Interestingly, however, the country's dignitaries could not find an Egyptian who could rule them or whom they wanted to rule them, and instead had to ask an Ottoman soldier from Albania to do so. Muhammad Ali Pasha was a clever strategist. He had little interest in religion, but he had endeared himself to the Egyptians through his apparent religious zeal until he was offered power. His first official act was to exile all religious leaders into the desert and to murder all military generals who wanted to share power with him in a notorious massacre during a banquet to which he had invited them. Following the example of France, the new monarch wanted to not only shape Egypt into a modern state, but also build it into a major power. At a breathtaking pace, Muhammad Ali Pasha had modern factories built and sent young scholars to Europe whom he had chosen to be the driving force behind modernization. Among them was the young Rafai al-Tahta'i, died 1873, who later established the Arab world's first foreign language school in Cairo, of which I am a graduate. Most of Tahta'i's translations, however, were not scientific or philosophical works, but military documents, for Muhammad Ali Pasha, with an eye on the European states, had come to the conclusion that no country could modernize without a strong army. Muhammad Ali Pasha sent expeditions to the Arabian Peninsula and crushed the revolt of the radical Wahhabis and to Africa to control the sources of the Nile. Modern irrigation systems, new administration, and tax models boosted the Egyptian economy. He built a massive fleet and a modern army, wanted to separate Egypt from the Ottoman Empire, and expressed ambitions to dominate the Mediterranean. At this point, the mutually hostile English, French, and Russians took notice, allied themselves, and destroyed the Egyptian fleet off the Greek coast in the Battle of Novarino in 1827. Like the German Empire, Muhammad Ali Pasha saw Egypt as a belated nation. It wanted to take its place in the world when the cake had already been divided among the major nations. Muhammad Ali Pasha's attempts at modernization bore only short-term fruit as they did not arise from the popular consciousness, but were dictated from above. The reforms proceeded at a pace that most Egyptians could not keep up with. Furthermore, these reforms did not result in a modernization of thought and the democratization of the country, but rather in a new phase of autocracy and despotism. Muhammad Ali Pasha utilized the feudal system, distributed land among his family and loyal soldiers and executed anyone who contradicted his policies. Thus, he remained a role model for modern Oriental rulers, who initiated modernization processes but retained the old pattern of rule. Muhammad Ali Pasha embraced the material instruments of modernity and ignored the ideas behind it, a phenomenon that permeates modern Islamic history and which political scientist Bassam Tibi calls half-modernity. Despite repeated attempts at modernization, the Islamic world failed to connect with Europe, unable or unwilling to reconcile itself with the spirit of modernity. Haditha, the Arabic term for modernity, which dates back to the 19th century, implies the beginning of a new era. It is linguistically related to the term mudatha, something new, which has very negative connotations in Orthodox Islam. The Prophet Muhammad is said to have said, "Every mudatha is an invention, and every invention leads to confusion, and every confusion lands in hell." While this represents innovation in religious practice, it also damaged the secular concept of renewal. Comparing the Arabic and Japanese terms for modernization, one can understand the difference in attitudes toward renewal. The Japanese term, also coined at the end of the 19th century, is bunmei kaika, the opening of civilization. The Japanese called this process leaving Asia and going to Europe. Fukuzawa Yakuchi, a prominent political theorist of the Meiji era, wrote an essay in 1885 entitled Datsuaran, or Goodbye, Asia, in which he rallied his compatriots to modernity. The winds of westernization are blowing strongly, bringing with them for the Japanese, the possibility of tasting the fears of civilization or the choice of remaining trapped in their own fate. At that time, Japan was undergoing a process similar to that of Egypt in the first decades of the 19th century. It was building a strong army, but also opted for the country's intellectual opening and based its industrial innovations on ancient Japanese craft traditions. At least at that time, Japan's new military might refuse to engage in confrontation with the European powers and built the infrastructure of a modern state without any shrill tone. However, one cannot claim that Japan has completely embraced the spirit of modernity. Even today, the land of the rising sun still has noticeable deficits in its understanding of democracy and gender equality. But the idea of openness and the integration of European technology and science have never been hindered by hostility toward the West. Even after the horrific experiences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no anti-Western resentment arose in devastated Japan. In contrast, from the perspective of many Muslims, modernity came across the Mediterranean on warships and was repeatedly dictated by a colonial master or a native despot. It was not explained or made palatable to Muslims by anyone like Fukuzawa Yakuchi. The Japanese creativity that allowed modernity to flow into their own tradition was lacking in the Islamic world, for the simple reason that for Arabs, the term haditha, modernity, remained a contrast to the term turath, which means spiritual heritage or tradition. In the course of nation building, a new term was introduced that indicated the direction, asala, meaning authenticity, distinctiveness or originality. In addition to this, whenever Muslims looked for bases for their new identity in their own traditional history, they ended up with the golden calf, which they began to worship. Either the brutal theocracy or the supposedly secular autocrat who, in the style of an ancient Arabian tribal leader, formed a personality cult around himself and ruled with an iron fist. Orthodoxy offers the only possibility of retreat and rejection, toward the status quo, or toward a real or fictitious status quo ante of culture. It is a kind of reinsurance against any adventure of openness. And because it always remains in the back of one's mind, it disrupts every new beginning and casts doubt on the viability of change. Anyone who strolled through Cairo, Tehran, or even Kabul 40 years ago would hardly recognize the three cities today. Apart from the fact that the populations there have more than doubled, one can see that many modernization processes have been reversed. While back then you could hardly see a veiled woman on the street, today practically everyone is Islamically correct. I remember that my aunt from Cairo visited us in our village on the Nile 30 years ago in a miniskirt and smoked on the street, which I thought was cool. Back then, it hardly bothered anyone. Today, her daughter is fully veiled. My aunt, who is now also in uniform, looks back on that time and asks God for forgiveness for her great sin. Should a woman dare to walk through my village today without a headscarf, she can expect to be harassed at best. Women, in particular, ensure that none of their kind step out of line. But even without collective pressure, a return to conservative Islam is the shortest path for Muslims who get into trouble. In Paris in 2006, I met Faten. The Arabic word means seductress. A young Tunisian singer who comes from a very secular family in Tunis and received a Western-oriented education in her home country before coming to the French capital. The negative image of Islam in the Western media led Faten to veil herself and attend a mosque for the first time in her life. When in Tunis, she must remove the veil, otherwise, her father would be upset, considering it a sign of backwardness. Another French Muslim woman called Islam my raison d'être, or her reason for existence. I heard a story almost identical to Faten's from Aysun, a Turkish-born dentist in Copenhagen. Although she was born in Denmark, was non-religious and lived like any other Danish girl, a few years ago she asked herself, "Who am I?" First, she wore t-shirts with the Turkish flag, now she wears the veil, and ever since, she has felt safe. Next, she wants to leave Denmark and live in the multicultural paradise of England. The shyness or fear of modernity can be illustrated by an Indian story. An ant from the Sugar Mountain meets an ant from the Salt Mountain in the valley between the two mountains. One ant tells the other about the sweet taste of sugar, but the other cannot imagine what it tastes like. The other promises to bring a sachet of sugar tomorrow so the other can get to know the taste. Before the other leaves her cave the next day, she takes a piece of salt and hides it under her tongue so that she has something for lunch in case the sugar doesn't taste good to her. When she takes the sachet of sugar, she puts it in her mouth and notices a strange taste. "That tastes average," she says. The other ant is surprised because she knows how good her sugar tastes. She instinctively knows that something is wrong with the other's tongue and asks her to open her mouth, where she discovers the sachet of salt. In the Indian version of the story, the sugar ant convinces its colleague to spit out the salt and rinse its mouth to enjoy the sugar. The story ends with the salt ant smiling enthusiastically, happy about discovering a new taste. If there is an Arabic version of this story, it ends like this: the salt ant would refuse to remove the salt from its mouth, or it would betray its ancestors, who knew nothing but salt. And even if it were tempted to eat sugar, it would soon develop a guilty conscience, return repentant to the mountain of salt, and curse all sweetness from then on. I once had a devout Muslim friend to whom I was asked to describe the taste of beer. I recommended that he order a non-alcoholic beer so he could get to know it, but he refused, saying that if he liked the taste and there wasn't a non-alcoholic beer nearby, he might commit the grave sin of ordering a beer with alcohol. This explains why many young Muslims who immigrate to Europe to live in freedom soon return to the mosque and become even more religious than they ever were. They don't just stick to religious symbols, like the women described above, because men often believe they have to win one identity battle after another. At first they dare to exercise a great deal of freedom, taste the forbidden fruits of the West, burn their fingers, and return to God. As a sign of reparation, they detest everything Western and blame the unbelieving West for their error. Sayyid Qutb, one of the chief ideologists and co-founders of the radical Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, spent 2 years in America before returning to his homeland as a radical Muslim. Before this trip, he was a westernized, secular Egyptian. Afterward, he harbored only hatred and contempt for the decadent West. This is true of many of the 9/11 attackers, who arrived in Europe or America seemingly completely westernized and underwent a long process of radicalization abroad before hitting a wall. Abu Hamza, the British fundamentalist leader, also described unbelievers as animals in a sermon and advised Muslims. If you have control over them, you may take them to the market and sell them there, if not, then simply slaughter them. Before his radical career began, he was a bouncer at a London nightclub. Perhaps the cause of the radical Islamization of many Muslims in the West is a violation of their sense of shame or the anthropological wound inflicted in these people by a foreign culture. Or perhaps it is simply the appeal of Islamic orthodoxy, with its clear and guiding division of the world according to denominations, which dehumanizes unbelievers, and leaves them open to attack. Regardless of how liberal Muslims may be, many of them remain tied with a rubber band to their tradition and the simple geography of division. And no matter how far they stray from it, they eventually return and collide with the status quo. The further they stray, the harder the impact on their return. This is how terrorists are born, who burn all bridges to and from themselves and turn their own lives into an experiment. Therefore, it is a fallacy to believe that time alone is sufficient to guarantee change, because most things just go in circles or even backwards. As early as the 8th century, there was an Islamic school of thought called the Mu'tazila, which viewed the Quran not as an eternal, but as a historical text. According to this school, the Quran could be analyzed and criticized, an idea that even pleased the Caliph in Baghdad at the time, whereupon he supported the group's followers. In the last quarter of the 20th century, the Egyptian linguist Abu Zayd was forcibly divorced from his wife and had to leave Egypt because he revived the heretical ideas of the Mu'tazila. In the 1930s, Egypt was much more cosmopolitan and liberal than it is today. In 1926, Egyptian feminist Huda Sha'arawi tore off her veil in Cairo's largest square and called on Muslim women to follow her example. As a result, she was considered a hero, and a Cairo street was named after her. In 1937, an Egyptian intellectual published a book titled Why I Am an Atheist. At the time, there was no fuss about it. Only a religious poet wrote a book in response, titled Why I Am a Believer. If an Egyptian woman dares to demonstratively lift the veil today, she would likely be crushed by the masses, as it has become more than just a symbol of struggle. If someone were to write a book about their loss of faith, their life expectancy would be drastically shortened. The Egyptian Farag Utpto was murdered by extremists in front of his house in 1992 after an Al-Azhar commission issued a fatwa against him, accusing him of blasphemy. He hadn't doubted the existence of God or called the Prophet a child molester, but rather publicly advocated for the separation of religion and state. 7 years earlier, the Sudanese theologian Mahmoud Mohammed Taha had been executed in Khartoum for describing Sharia as a historical construct that no longer had any validity today. Taha was the only Arab intellectual who, during the heyday of nationalism in the 1960s, advocated reconciliation with Israel so that the Arabs could invest the energy and resources they wasted on armaments into rebuilding their countries. For this reason alone. But this mentality is not new in Islam. It is not, as many assume, a new phenomenon in reaction to modernity. Even in the so-called Golden Age of Islam, when Arabic science and philosophy flourished, there was a fierce clash between rational thought and literalism, which ended with the victory of the traditionalists, for whom continuity was more important than innovation. The Golden Age in Andalusia is often cited as an example of Muslim tolerance toward Jews and Christians and of the fruitful scientific cooperation between the three religions. The American historian Mark Cohen considers this a myth invented by Jewish intellectuals in 19th-century Europe as a kind of historical escape from the bitter reality of European anti-Semitism. Beyond the utopian idea of confessional tolerance, the history of Andalusia is also associated with false notions in the collective Arab memory. The conquest of Andalusia by the Arabs is considered legitimate, while the reconquista by the Christian kings Ferdinand and Isabella is considered a crime. Forgotten are the divisions among the Muslims in Andalusia and the mutual fighting. Also forgotten is the fact that intolerance in Andalusia began 2 centuries before the Reconquista, with the immigration of radical Muslim Berbers who had no regard for science and philosophy. Had the works of the great philosopher Averroes burned, and drove him into exile in Marrakesh. Since then, there has been no process in Islamic history that could be called reform, but only brief, well-intentioned waves of renewal that failed to undermine the rock of orthodoxy. Or let's change the image. Islamic reform movements resemble only small, isolated streams that petered out and never managed to unite into a large, powerful current that could have swept much with it and set in motion an irreversible process called enlightenment. The very understanding of what a process actually is doesn't exist. The Arabic language doesn't even have the word process. It is mistakenly translated as Amalia, which means operation. This implies that it refers to a short, completed action. Likewise, the word sustainability is translated as istimrariya, meaning continuity. An example of how processes are managed in Arabic thought is the story of Abbas ibn Firnas. The physicist from Córdoba attempted to fly in the 9th century. He observed the birds for a long time and, with great precision, built 2 wings to carry him. It was a beautiful day, and the wind was on his side. He lifted off the ground, and it seemed as if nothing could stop him. But after 400 meters, he suddenly fell and broke both his legs. He never attempted it again, and no one after him dared the adventure. The Faustian soul remained grounded. Naturally, the European colonial powers played a negative role in modern Islamic history and were not particularly interested in modernizing the Islamic countries they occupied. Their aggressive and arrogant demeanor made them unsuitable role models for Muslims. But no matter what the colonial rulers did, they could only have done wrong. When they, like the English, did not interfere culturally in the colonies, it was said that they were indifferent and simply wanted to plunder the Muslims' resources. When they established schools and cultural institutions, as was common in the French colonies, it was said that they wanted to proselytize and undermine Islamic culture. The prevailing belief was that nothing good could come from the land of the unbelievers. This psychological barrier always stood between the Islamic world and the West. Even today, decades after the end of colonialism, many in the Islamic world view comprehensive modernization as a surrender to the West. Certainly, Western power politics plays an important role in this perception among Muslims, a power politics that constantly and not always beneficially influences the many unresolved conflicts in the Islamic world, from Chechnya to the Middle East. Nevertheless, I see other, crucial reasons for Muslims' chronic resentment. At its core, Muslim self-image is responsible for this. They still see themselves as the bearers of a sophisticated culture and cannot accept that they long ago lost a leading position in the world. Islam has not been able to cope with the loss of power, the Tunisian-born French writer Abdelwahab Meddeb succinctly puts it. The resulting resentment feeds Islamic fundamentalism, which Meddeb identifies as the source of Islamic fundamentalism, which Meddeb identifies as the source of Islamic disease. An archaic culture of honor and resistance prevents fruitful cooperation with the West, which is preferred to be reduced to the enemy. Meddeb explains the psychology of the resentful person, in the sense of Nietzsche, as someone who considers himself superior to the circumstances in which he lives. For the German philosopher, resentment arises from the subjective feeling of being constantly treated unfairly. He thus sees the psychology of resentment as self-poisoning through unfulfilled, inhibited revenge. Thoughts of revenge that are not carried out, according to Nietzsche, are like a fever that one never gets rid of. Resentment, however, can serve, at least in Adorno's sense, as a motor for mobilizing one's own resources. Emotions are mobilized against the outgroup in order to weld one's own group together. On the other hand, one must rally the in-group so that it can wage the struggle against the outgroup more effectively. Sometimes I have the feeling that we Muslims enjoy being insulted by the West. It seems to me like a masochistic game that proves to us that we're alive. We would like the West to have something against us. It's good for our wounded souls to at least believe that the West is targeting us and wants to destroy us. Because if the West were to ignore us completely, we would feel insignificant, degenerate, and meaningless. It's good for us to believe that our adversary is a potent opponent who cares about how to annoy us. On the one hand, this anger can be a means of retreat and an expression of passivity. If one can neither win nor compete materially against the West, one at least wants to stand up to it in the fight against globalization, capitalism, and exploitation. On the other hand, I also think that behind these resentments lies a love-hate relationship. We take the West too seriously, we are practically obsessed with it. And it hurts us that we receive too little recognition from it. Just as news of insults to Islam by the West is prominently reported in the Arab media, one registers news of words of appreciation for Islam by Western politicians or intellectuals. While former U.S. President George W. Bush was sent off from Iraq with a school bus, his successor Barack Obama was received with a standing ovation in Cairo. His speech at Cairo University in June 2009, in which he praised Islam's cultural contribution to humanity, was balm for the wounded souls of many Muslims. He quoted the Quran 6 times. 6 times his Muslim listeners responded with thunderous applause. It is a particular joy for Muslims when a prominent Western figure extols the merits of Islam or converts to Islam. However, these individuals are often viewed by Muslims as exceptions and therefore as arguments against the West, rather than as central representatives. Chapter 6: The Anger Industry, or, I am a Muslim, so I am offended. We Muslims seem to suffer seriously from the chronic disease of resentment. Hardly a day goes by without us showing the world how offended and humiliated we feel. As if the internal problems in Islamic countries weren't causing enough anger and frustration, we scour the newspapers daily for news of an oppressed Muslim minority in China, Thailand, or Europe, only to find further confirmation that a global conspiracy against Islam is afoot. And when we find nothing, we move on to looking for a cartoonist who hid a bomb in the Prophet Muhammad's turban, or a pope who called Islam an unreasonable religion, or even a football club whose anthem claims that the Prophet knew nothing about football. In short, we always find something with which to indulge our cherished offense. We throw Molotov cocktails, a crude bomb made of a bottle filled with a flammable liquid, such as gasoline, at Western embassies to refute the accusation of terrorism against our prophet and react unreasonably to the Pope's speech to prove him wrong. A British teacher is arrested in Sudan for naming her teddy bear Mohammed. Muslims feel offended by the anthem of the Schalke 04 football club, which states, "Mohammed was a prophet who understood nothing about football." The creators of the New York animated comedy series South Park are receiving death threats because, to avoid showing the prophet's face, they hid him in a teddy bear costume. In the same series, Moses, Jesus, and Buddha were repeatedly satirized without any protests or threats from Jewish, Christian, or Buddhist circles. Muslims are even insulted by their own centuries-old literature. For example, the Tales from 1001 Nights, the vast collection of Persian narratives that are now considered world literature, are banned in Saudi Arabia because they allegedly contain immoral and erotic passages. For the same reason, in the spring of 2010, a group of Egyptian lawyers calling themselves Lawyers Without Borders filed a lawsuit against officials in the Ministry of Culture in Cairo who commissioned a new edition of Tales from 1001 Nights. But the insult seems to taste most delicious only when it comes from the West. When you read the headlines of an Arab newspaper or watch the news on an Arab satellite channel, you can't help but get the impression that Muslims believe the West is a single, unified mass whose sole purpose is to annoy Muslims day in and day out. This unhealthy mix of fantasies of omnipotence and a feeling of constant humiliation creates an explosive paranoia with fatal consequences. Because nothing is more dangerous than a weakling with visions of omnipotence. What Muslims refuse to admit is that they are virtually insignificant to the West. Western states simply go about their daily business, not always concerned about whether they hurt Muslims, Brazilians, or the Martians. Only fear of terrorism or 100. Economic consequences sometimes creates the appearance of Western consideration and respect for other cultures. This respect is particularly evident towards dictatorships like Saudi Arabia and Iran. During Islam's heyday between the 8th and 11th centuries, the writing of heretical texts was commonplace. Drinking alcohol and women not wearing headscarves were not uncommon. At that time, there were more bars in Baghdad alone than in all Islamic countries combined today. Muslims felt so self-confident that anti-Islamic polemics from Christians and Jews were tolerated. The Caliph of Baghdad even regularly organized a polemic competition in which Muslims, Jews, and Christians criticized each other's religions in poetic polemics. One could therefore identify a connection between self-confidence, the tolerance of personal freedoms, and the cultural boom that Islam enjoyed in the Middle Ages. Or, conversely, one could interpret the sense of one's own strength as the reason for this composure. The thin-skinned nature of today's Muslims and their insistence on religious symbols are therefore an expression of weakness, the result of an outdated understanding of hierarchy in Islam, and are 101. Leading parts of the Islamic world into increasing isolation and reinforcing their sense of humiliation. There is currently virtually no healthy communication between the West and the Islamic world. The tragic murder of the Egyptian pharmacist Marwa al-Sherbani in the Dresden courtroom in early July 2009 preoccupied the public in Egypt and many Islamic countries for months. They asked themselves not only why the German government had reacted too late to this case, but also why no one in the courtroom had rushed to help the petite 31-year-old woman when Alex W. stabbed her 18 times. And why did the German police officer shoot Marwa's husband as the perpetrator? Was it because the husband looked Arab and therefore appeared to the police officer to be the likely perpetrator? The answer that Muslim intellectuals such as the Egyptian best-selling author Alaa al-Aswami offer to these questions: racism and Islamophobia among the Germans. My hospitable Egyptian compatriots don't realize that civil courage is in short supply in Germany. Even if the victim had been a German, presumably none of those present in the room would have stepped forward to save her. Many Germans have 102 grown accustomed to the fact that Father State takes care of everything. When it comes to security, no one in this country can rely on their fellow citizens. The fact that the police officer fired at the victim's husband rather than the perpetrator was likely just a misunderstanding, but this case is about much more than just a misunderstanding. It's about a long history of mutual fear and mistrust between the West and the Islamic world. But who is to blame for this climate? Is it really only the Western media and populists like Thilo Sarrazin who allegedly stir up anti-Muslim resentment, or aren't the Muslim fanatics who carry out terrorist attacks, incite them, or condone them also to blame? Because even if these media images and statements are sometimes selective or exaggerated, they are not invented. They describe aspects and problems of contemporary Islam that many Muslims fail to perceive. People would rather be angry at the others than at themselves and their self-inflicted misery. Especially in Islamic countries, people are extremely dissatisfied with the economic and political situation and unable to solve their problems on their own. Both those in power and the frustrated. 103. Population are therefore looking for scapegoats for their own misery. The masses take to the streets and demonstrate, cursing "our blood is expensive, death to Germany," and boycott German products, ostensibly to show solidarity with the murdered Egyptian woman. This is merely popular anger being used as folk medicine, with the approval of the security forces, in countries where demonstrations are actually prohibited. This energy-sapping battle against windmills distracts from reform debates and helps those in power further consolidate their power.